So the three new markers that have been put up that you've done your research for, the topics are Seneca Town and Calhoun Bottoms, Fort Hill Slave Cemetery, and the Woodland Cemetery. And then the third one is the Fort Hill Slave Quarters and Convict Labor Stocking. So how did your team decide these would be the topics rather than some other topics?
Those are three of the most significant sites associated with African American history on campus, and they were not marked in any way. So nobody knew when they were walking by Lee Hall that the slave quarters was right down the road, or the convict stockade was right where the Strong Thurman Institute is. So Clemson land is really interesting because it's a layered history. And so one of the reasons we chose the Bottoms area is because that land originally was inhabited by Cherokees. So there were just these really significant spaces on campus that didn't have any markers. The cemetery, you go over there and it's Woodland Cemetery. It was founded in the early 1920s, but the slave cemetery is unmarked. There was no sign, and so now when you go in, there's a marker right there, and when you read it, you look to the right and you actually can see that chain link fence where the cemetery is located. So we just wanted to make sure that three of the most significant sites associated with Clemson's Black history were marked, but also to note that that's not the only story in those spaces, that we wanted them to point to this layered history.
What setbacks or problems did you and your team face during this project?
It's just a really long process. So we met together, we had to do the research, then we had to contact the South Carolina Department of History and Archives because they actually approved the text. So we had to get the money, they're not.
I was gonna say it's not free.
So we had to find a donor, to pay for the markers, and then we had to go through the process. So at Clemson, you put together an application. It took over a year to actually get everything approved. There are like 4 different groups that it has to go through. And then we had some questions about wording on the text because you only get so many words and characters. So you have to be really particular about what you say.
Yeah, and what can fit and what gets left
and
out.
what can't fit. And so some of the things that got left out that we really wanted were the ages of the convicts. So right now it just says predominantly African American state convict crew. We wanted them to add the age range of 13 to 67. But there are some trustees who did not want that information on publicly displayed on campus. So we didn't win that battle, but we got the markers up, and for that we're grateful because at least people can see that there's this history on campus and ask questions.
What made you want to be a part of this process to create all of these historical markers?
When I arrived at Clemson back in 2007, I had no idea about the history of this university. On my very first day on campus, one of my colleagues took me on a campus tour, and we came to this building, Strode, and he said, "I need to show you something." And we walked across Library Bridge, and I was like, where is he taking me? And he took me to the plantation house, the Fort Hill Plantation House, and I was like, whoa, what? Wait, hold up. Why is there a plantation house in the middle of this campus? And I was wondering, why didn't anybody tell me? And what my colleagues didn't know was that I hated historic plantations, that I had gone on tours of them, and the tours had been awful. They had only talked about the food or the architecture or the landscaping, and they didn't say anything about slavery. And so I had just vowed I would never go to a historic plantation again. And then all of a sudden I was working on one. And then when I found out there was not really any much conversation about the history of slavery. And then when I found out about the convict laborers and the sharecroppers, so it was like slavery and its legacies enacted on Clemson land, I asked if they could add more markers, and I was told no at that time. So I decided that I would try and bring some changes about on campus. 3 or 4 years in, I really started turning my attention to this work and asking lots of questions and going over the special collections and archives and finding out that there was a lot of information here. It just wasn't being shared. So I decided to share it. And that's how my project was born, and then got some additional support and funding from one of Clemson's most distinguished alums, James Bostic Jr. Dr. Bostic graduated as the first PhD, African-American PhD in 1972. He heard about my work. He and his wife have been supporting me, and then the provost, he convinced the provost to also provide some financial support. And so once I had the money, I could hire research assistants, I could travel, I could go to conferences, and the project just took off. It became a lot more than I envisioned. I just really wanted to make the information accessible to Clemson, but now it's being shared with the world.
Why do you think they said no at first when you asked?
I think that people are uncomfortable talking about slavery. I was told at Clemson that the topic was deemed controversial and therefore not to be discussed publicly unless people asked, for information. So some people, just are really, really uncomfortable talking about slavery. Some people feel guilt by association. So if your ancestors were slaveholders, then somehow that makes you guilty. I don't understand that, but some people do. Or some people just want to put it in the past, like it happened.
Move on.
We move on. We're sorry it happened, but we can't do anything about it. So let's just focus on happier, things.
Happier topics.
Yeah, not painful things. It's a difficult topic, but it's not depressing to me. It's a story of survival and resilience. It's a story of people overcoming enormous odds. So for me, it's inspirational. And I think it's part of our history, and we can't pick and choose. I want to embrace it all and learn from it all. And I think that young people are smart enough and bright enough to deal with topics that are challenging. And I think Clemson history enables all of us to learn how to have difficult conversations and to not be afraid, not be, not want to find a way to avoid discomfort, but to actually embrace it and say, what can I learn from this?
On top of all these markers, you've also created a project called the Call My Name Project. So how do you think that research helped contribute to the new historical markers installed in 2016?
Yeah, I was just starting that research. So those two projects kind of, had the same moment of birth. I think one of the first people that I met was a woman by the name of Eva Hester Martin. Mrs. Martin is a direct descendant of enslaved persons who worked on Fort Hill. And Mrs. Martin somehow heard about my work and was trying to meet me, and then some people in the community introduced me to her. And so when I walked into her house, she had a picture of about 6 or 7 generations of her family, starting with her great-grandmother who was enslaved. Just went down to her great-grandchildren, and I just couldn't believe it. It was like the story that I had been looking for. And so we were able to bring her to the groundbreaking ceremony for the South Carolina historical markers, and she and her husband and her daughter were there as our special guests. And so at that moment, and then there was news reports, and then people saw the news, and then people started calling me. And so, the marker project, helped to bring attention to the work that I was doing, and really helped me to see that I had a larger audience that needed to see this and hear this and engage with this history. I saw the power of bringing those descendants in and creating living history, not just markers. So Call My Name, one of the things that we're working on now is creating those spaces where people just have complete ownership of their story, and they get to tell us what they want, how they want, in those spaces. And if we ask questions that they don't want to answer, then that's their prerogative. But they have control of their narratives, and I think it's important for us to hear directly from these descendants.
How do you think that Clemson University has improved from having these markers?
There's more of a willingness to engage with this history. I went from, going to a different president before President Clements was here and saying, you can do whatever you want, but, Clemson is not interested, to an administration that says, wow, this is so compelling, and we need to share it with everybody. Everybody needs to engage with this history. It's a story about, this journey from slavery to integration, this journey from slavery to freedom, looking at how that was enacted on Clemson land. What can we learn from that? We're an educational institution, right?
Yes.
You know, so it should be an easy thing for us to look at our own history and figure out how we can learn from our own history. So I would say I have seen a tremendous turn in the way the administration looks at this history and its willingness to make it accessible to students and to the wider community, and also to build these relationships between the local community. There are a lot of people who still live in the Clemson area, who worked at Clemson, or whose parents or grandparents worked at Clemson. So sort of bringing all of these different groups together and saying, this is our history. It's not the university, but it's ours. So how can we work together to make sure this history is documented and shared?
Do you think that any more markers should be added to the campus? And if so, do you have an idea of what kind of topics you would add?
There's a group of students actually who are working on a monument to Black laborers.
Wow.
So it would include the names of enslaved persons, sharecroppers, wage workers, even the musicians, because they basically were laborers. They came and they performed, and they couldn't stay on campus or eat on campus during the Jim Crow era. They talked to me about their desire to have a public display on campus so people can see these names, and for the convict laborers to see the ages, because so many of them were under the age of 25. So to know that middle school age, high school age, college age boys and young men built Clemson, built this school that we all love, I think it's important to them. So that is definitely an endeavor that I wholeheartedly support. I also think that there needs to be some kind of acknowledgement of women's contributions to Clemson. We don't have any buildings on our campus named for women. So it's a pretty big omission, and I think we need to do something about that. We've also thought about creating kind of a memorial space that tells the story of Clemson. So instead of like putting a statue of Harvey Gantt up or a statue of Anna Clemson up, it would be kind of this panorama of figures and images that would start with the Cherokee era and come into the 21st century, and it would be kind of park-like where you could go. There might be a reflection pool, there would be benches. So you could go there, we could have programs there, to talk about the history. Because it's hard to like choose a person, right? Like who is the person who gets a statue or a memorial? So why don't we create, kind of this panoramic view of Clemson history, and say this is kind of representative of all the people, all the contributions that have been made to create this university. The more contemporary way to create memorials is these interactive spaces where people are learning from the memorial, they're interacting with the memorial. The space is there for them to have conversations with other people. And so that's the kind of space that I would like to see on campus somewhere, where people can see that whole narrative and see all of the different people who were significant contributors to Clemson history, and then use that space as a place where we come and reflect. There are definitely some conversations happening now about how to create a space that truly encompasses as much of the history as we could represent.